Welcome to the Struggle for Black Equality, a series of conversations that attempt to answer the question, why has it been such a difficult struggle for Black Americans to gain basic civil rights, the right to eat in a restaurant, live in a neighborhood, go to a school, work a job, and be treated equally under the law? This conversation, The Black Response to Jim Crow 1930 to 1950, looks at the struggle in this era and focuses on the new ideological consensus, the Great Depression, the New Deal, World War II and the new militancy, the March on Washington, the race riots of 1943, post-war gains and setbacks, the decline of racist ideology, and the shift of tactics of white supremacists to portraying blacks as communists. The 1930s saw the rise of a new ideological consensus that accentuated the influence of environment on human behavior and de-emphasized the idea of innate characteristics. The new consensus stressed the damage done to individuals by prejudice and the cost to the nation of discrimination, and at the same time demolished the stereotype of blacks as contented. Emphasizing environmental influences over innate characteristics undermined the idea of innate racial inferiority and put white supremacists on the defensive. The stock market crash of 1929 sent America and the world into what is known as the Great Depression. Because of discrimination in the workplace, Black Americans were disproportionately affected by the Depression. Discrimination kept Black workers in the lowest paid positions. In Pittsburgh, for example, when blacks began to gain access to jobs in the steel industry, they faced discriminatory promotion practices that kept them in the lowest paid jobs. When the Depression hit, blacks were the first to be laid off. As a result, white unemployment in the country was at 25% overall, but black unemployment rose to 50%. President Franklin Roosevelt was elected in 1932 to address the Depression with his vast program of reform, relief, and recovery called the New Deal, which brought advances and setbacks for Black Americans. The advances for blacks included appointments to more than 100 positions in the Roosevelt administration. The number of black federal employees tripled. Desegregation of federal restrooms, cafeterias, and secretarial pools, and appointments to the Supreme Court that were favorable to issues of Black Americans. Roosevelt even went as far to have a black cabinet of advisors. To deal with the housing crisis, Roosevelt first created the Homeowners Loan Corporation in 1933 to refinance home mortgages in default, to prevent foreclosures, and to expand home buying opportunities. It was this agency that instituted the system of redlining, color-coding maps to designate black neighborhoods and surrounding areas as high risk for these loans. Roosevelt also created the Federal Housing Authority in 1934 to regulate interest rates and terms of mortgages it insured. The FHA loans were restricted to white Americans only. The FHA underwriting manual explained the reasoning for this. Quote, "If a neighborhood is to retain stability, it is necessary that property shall continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes. A change in social or racial occupancy generally leads to instability and reduction of values." Unquote. The FHA then directed that mortgages be approved where, quote, "protection against adverse influences is attained," unquote, and defined these adverse influences as, quote, "infiltration by inharmonious racial groups or nationality groups." World War II brought a new militancy to the struggle for Black equality. The government's need for loyalty and manpower gave blacks unique leverage that they translated into the concept of the double V, victory at home and abroad. NAACP membership grew tenfold during this time. James Farmer and Bayard Rustin formed the Congress of Racial Equality in 1942 to promote nonviolent direct action to protest Jim Crow. The Black socialist A. Philip Randolph came up with the most successful Black protest, the concept of a March on Washington, something that did not happen at this time. Randolph was the head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which created the journal The Messenger. Randolph threatened a march in 1941 to protest racial discrimination in war industries, segregation in the military, and to promote an anti-lynching law. In response, Roosevelt issued Executive Order 8802 in 1941, which banned discrimination in war industries and created the President's Committee on Fair Employment Practices. As a result, 2 million blacks gained jobs in war industries, and the march was canceled. This period also saw significant racial tension, as evidenced in the race riots of 1943. In Detroit, the city constructed a housing project for blacks in a white neighborhood. Whites protested, and a confrontation ensued, inflamed by rumors that spread within the white and black communities. To quell the violence, 6,000 federal troops had to be called in. In Harlem, Robert Brandy, a World War II soldier, hit a white police officer and was shot as he fled arrest. Blacks attacked white property in Harlem in response. The riots frightened black leaders who began organizing good conduct campaigns to encourage nonviolent protest. They also quelled the protest movement in general. 71% of blacks opposed the March on Washington, and every black newspaper denounced Randolph's call in 1943 for civil disobedience to Jim Crow laws. Even CORE's direct action program failed. In 1948, President Truman ended segregation in the armed forces with Executive Order 9981. Segregated military units were the norm since the Civil War. Typically, the involvement of blacks in the military followed this program. No black soldiers, and then black soldiers doing menial labor, followed by black soldiers being used in combat when it was absolutely necessary, but in segregated units. The post-war period saw other gains and setbacks for black Americans. Jackie Robinson broke the Keller barrier in baseball, but faced discrimination in hotels and restaurants. Dr. Charles R. Drew discovered how to store blood in blood banks, which made blood transfusions possible, but later resigned his post whenever the government refused to allow the blood of white and black Americans to be stored together. The new Levintowns in the suburbs, built for World War II vets, and the VA loans to purchase them were denied to blacks for the same reasons outlined by the FHA in the 1930s. But the growth of the American economy allowed many blacks to access better jobs. Median income doubled, and 40% of blacks were engaged in professional, skilled, or semi-skilled jobs. The number of blacks in schools and colleges also increased significantly. There's no question that World War II accelerated the progress toward black equality. So did the Second Great Migration, a movement of blacks from farms to northern cities that freed blacks from the isolation and caste system of the rural South. Large numbers of blacks living in close proximity in cities fostered group consciousness and solidarity, which have allowed blacks to develop new norms and beliefs. This movement, though, resulted in a reactive movement termed by historians as white flight, the movement of white northerners out of inner cities to the suburbs. Another important development of the post-war era was the decline in the credibility of racist ideas, which was fostered by the excesses of Nazism, the decline of Western imperialism, and books like Myrdal's An American Dilemma. In response to the growing unacceptability of racist ideology, white supremacists changed tactics to focus on fear of communism, arguing that challenges to the status quo were anti-American and linking the black struggle for equality to communism and subversion, even though most civil rights groups opposed any sort of radical action. The NAACP, for example, at this time focused less on protesting and more on litigation, working on fair housing and employment in the North, and voter registration and equal access to education in the South. The groundbreaking achievements of these efforts will be the focus of our next conversation. Some takeaways from our conversation. A new ideological consensus developed in the 1930s that accentuated the influence of environment over innate characteristics, stressed the damage done to individuals and the nation by discrimination, and demolished the idea of the contented Black American. The Great Depression hit Blacks harder than other groups, and Roosevelt's New Deal gave Blacks opportunity in federal jobs, but denied them opportunity in property ownership. World War II and the migration of Blacks to northern cities brought about a new militancy among Blacks that created new opportunities to protest, racial solidarity and consciousness, and led to both race riots and access to jobs in war industries. The post-war era saw both gains and setbacks for Blacks, including integration of the armed forces, housing discrimination, white flight, the decline of racist ideology, and the use of anti-communism by white supremacists to thwart Black equality. Some things to think about. What are the strengths and weaknesses of arguing for environmental influences over human behavior rather than innate characteristics? What are the strengths and weaknesses of the government's policies towards Blacks in this period? Which was the better path toward Black equality, the aggressive path of A. Philip Randolph and CORE, or the more conservative path of the NAACP? Why? Why would white supremacists choose to portray Black Americans and their struggle for Black equality as communist subversion? Some resources. W.E.B. Du Bois, A Negro Within a Nation from 1934 is essential. Langston Hughes' poem, Let America Be America Again. Lawrence Glasgow's essay, Double Burden, The Black Experience in Pittsburgh. And Richard Rothstein's new book, The Keller of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. Thanks for joining the conversation today. God bless you, and keep thinking about things that matter.